Welcome to the Nordic Mythology podcast. I'm Daniel Farrand, owner of the company Horns of Odin. And before we jump into the main show, I do have to do our little plugs, I guess, before. It's for our Patreon. It's Patreon/Nordic Mythology podcast. It's £3 a month, 10p a day. And what you get for that is you get a bonus episode every single week. You get ad-free episodes. You get early access to all the episodes. You can watch the episodes live and access to the live chat. So we have like an Inception situation going on. We have the main episode, and then within that we have the live chat where there's a bunch of other stuff going on. It's always a lot of fun and can be a little bit distracting sometimes too. You also get our Discord server where we have a lovely little community of listeners over there. And the tier up from that, you get the storytime episodes with myself and Jonas Lorentzen, where we've just started reading through Neil Gaiman's Norse Mythology. So there's a bunch of stuff on there, and more than anything, it just helps us keep going. It helps us keep the people who help the show behind the scenes employed, because there's a lot more to this than just me. You know, we have an editor, we have a social media person, we have advertising, booking, and it's all part of one big machine, and the Patreon is the main funding source behind it. We don't have anything else. So if you can pop over onto there and just take a look, it's Patreon/Nordic Mythology podcast, and it is just £3 a month. And if you can't support financially, which not everyone can, even just a share on Instagram, share on Facebook, it helps people find the podcast, as well as leaving a 5-star rating and a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. But with all that said, we have to jump into the main show. I'm really excited for this. It's an extension, I guess, or another week of spooky season. So we're doing a few back-to-back episodes of the spooky side of Nordic mythology. And this one's going to be on monsters. And I'm joined by Rebecca Merkelbach.
Yes.
I think everybody's used to me just saying the guest name with a question mark, because as you probably know, they're not the easiest names to say in this sphere.
Yeah, I mean, at least I'm not from Scandinavia, or Iceland at least, where names are even more complicated than weird German surnames.
Yeah, my problem is I just never want to offend anyone. So Absolutely. I just never back myself. Even though I ask right before, how do I pronounce it? And I say it over and over in my head. As soon as it comes to saying it like live with that I know is going to be recorded, I just panic and just go and just put like an affliction on the end of like, maybe it's this.
It was definitely that. Merkelbach is correct.
Perfect.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to be here today.
Can you just let people know who you are, what you do, I guess why you're here effectively?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm assistant professor of Old Norse Icelandic Studies at the University of Tübingen in southern Germany. I did my PhD on monsters in the Icelandic sagas. So I guess that is reason for me to be here. I've worked on the paranormal, a bunch on monsters, different types of monsters, especially in saga literature. And most recently, I just finished my second book, actually, which is going to be forthcoming next year on the so-called post-classical sagas of Icelanders. And there's a bunch of stuff on the paranormal and that, and on story worlds and all sorts of exciting, fantastic stuff.
So perfect for this time of year. Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Yeah, I love anything spooky and horror related. That's right up my alley. So whenever I get a chance to kind of learn more about the darker side of the world, I guess I'm always going to jump at it.
It is. I mean, I have to say this now because people will be shocked by it. I'm probably the only person who works on monsters who doesn't watch horror movies and doesn't really enjoy that kind of thing. Yeah, I know. I'm very sensitive, which is weird. But yeah, I don't watch horror at all, and I'm not really into that. But monsters in Old Norse are cool, and I love working on them. And for some reason, they haven't haunted me into my dreams yet, so that's a bonus.
Yeah, that's definitely good. No, I love horror films. I watched a film yesterday called Skinamarink, which is a weird name. And it was one of the most deeply disturbing films I've seen in a long time. And not much happens in this movie. It's like 110 minutes long, filmed from a child's perspective of like looking up at everything, and 90% of the film is just slow shots of blank walls. But for some reason, it's terrifying. It just draws you in. You don't see anybody's face in the film. It's all dialogue. There might be less than 50 words in the whole movie. But for some reason, it's just ridiculously scary. It's kind of built on atmosphere. So if anybody does get a chance to watch that, I would recommend it. But also, I could equally understand if people hated it because there isn't much going on. But it's certainly atmospheric, to say the least. So yeah, I love this stuff. Every time I can find a new horror film, especially if it's something that I haven't seen before, I'm right in there. So that's my little take, I guess. Just wanted to throw that out there because I like the film.
Yeah, no, it's good to know. I mean, being unsettled, that's kind of what draws us to these figures, isn't it? To the monstrous, to the uncanny, the weird. And the unsettling effects of the monster that's really what makes it so valuable in cultural terms. And that's what I was really working on, trying to draw out the reason why we have so many monsters in saga literature from the 13th and 14th centuries, and why Icelanders were so fascinated by them. Because, we don't really expect that. The sagas of Icelanders are always sort of supposed to be super realistic and like, focused on social realism and on the nitty gritty of like farmers at fisticuffs. That's what Jon Olafsson, an antiquarian in the 18th century, said, "Bændaflugust á" in Icelandic, farmers at fisticuffs. And that's what these sagas are supposed to be, according to older scholarship. But then suddenly there's a revenant that's like haunting the valley and like killing all the sheep. So what's that doing there? And then suddenly there's this berserk who, goes around and sexually assaults the women. So content warning, definitely we're going to be talking about abuse today, I'm sure, because that's definitely in those stories as well. So like what are these figures doing there? And that's sort of what interested me, coming from sort of monster theory backgrounds and stuff.
Mm-hmm. So is there a clear definition of what would constitute a monster when it comes to like Nordic literature and the mythology?
No. So we that was the first step, right? To find a definition of it, because it's very difficult to judge what a different culture would consider monstrous. Even with our own culture, there are so many different ways of approaching monstrosity. Is it something physical? Is it a deformity? Is it something social? Is it something psychological? Is it all of those things? So even with our own culture, it's very difficult to get a clear handle on it. But then how do you do that with a culture that's not your own and that's like 800 years in the past? So that was the first step. And people have done a lot of work on the concept of the troll, tröll, in Icelandic, especially Ármann Jakobsson, who's also a trollologist, a word that I love, people who work on trolls.
What a title.
I know, right? I always like to introduce myself as a doctor of trollology. But so Ármann basically looked at the concept of tröll and all the different creatures in Icelandic literature or Old Norse literature, in mythology and the sagas, that were called tröll. And he came up with a list of 13 different creatures. So we have the undead being referred to as trolls. We have extremely strong or tall or ugly people being referred to as trolls, berserks being referred to as trolls, magic users, heathen gods, all sorts of different creatures are sort of sublimated under this heading, as well as those creatures that we would nowadays maybe recognize as trolls that we see in movies like Troll Hunter, or this Norwegian movie that came out on Netflix a couple of months ago, which is called Troll, which is actually really good.
I enjoyed that. I did like that.
It's really close to the sagas. It's really cool. The trolls in this opposition to Christianity that's like super, super close to texts like Draugrs saga, for example. But anyway, so Ármann was looking at the breadth of the term and saying that we can't really know what a troll is just from looking at the word. So in my approach to monsters, I basically substituted the term monster for the human subgroup of tröll, of trolls. And I looked at the undead, magic users, and berserks, as well as those particularly strong and tall and ugly people who are often outlaws. So I looked at outlaws as well. In Gisla Saga, I think you've been talking about Gisla Saga on the podcast as well recently, right? So yeah, that was sort of the subgroup, just to basically try and understand what exactly makes these people trolls, and how they're perceived by the people around them. Because there's this theorist called Asa Simon Mittman who said, since we can't judge what is monstrous for a different culture, we have to look at the way it impacts those around it. So we have to look at the way that the monster interacts with its community, or the community on whose margins it sort of moves, and from the reaction, from the impact it has on those people. That's where we can then gauge whether something is monstrous or whether it's just problematic, whether it's just, disturbing, or if it actually crosses over into something more. So I found that a particularly helpful approach, because then it's not about what we think, but it's about what happens within the text and what happens within the society that's depicted in the text. And it's a lot more difficult to do that with mythology, just to because that's obviously a very different kind of society that we have. It's not human, it's supernatural, it's divine in some ways. Or, we have giants in opposition to the gods, but they're also constantly interacting, and like that interaction isn't necessarily disruptive. There becomes a lot more complex. So in saga literature, this concept works, especially in the sagas of Icelanders, but as soon as we cross outside of that territory, I think it gets more complicated.
That's interesting you said that, because in my mind I was thinking how if I was thinking about a monster from the mythology, from Nordic mythology, or from probably any mythology, I would instantly go to something non-human, something grotesque, and that typical kind of monster type creature, like say something mythological. But if I was to think of a monster in contemporary sense, I would think of Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer, a very human figure just doing monstrous acts, rather than a monstrous looking thing. So when you said about it's kind of defined a little bit more by their actions, I would say, that kind of makes perfect sense.
So it really depends on the context. In some sagas in some genres or groups, maybe genre is always a problematic word when it comes to medieval texts. In some groups of sagas, we do have the deformed monster. We do have troll women that have like noses that hang down to their chests, and like whose lips are sort of drooling, and they wear clothes that are so short at the back that you can see their genitals. So that's in the legendary sagas, where heroes go out into the wilderness and they encounter these creatures, and sometimes they have sex with them, and sometimes they have children with them, but they always have to come back into human society and leave the giantess behind. So there we do have that conceptualization. But in the sagas of Icelanders, where we were in sort of this pseudo-realistic Icelandic past, so people from sort of the 13th, 14th century looking back into their own past, you can't really depict that, apparently. So monstrosity becomes configured through humans who act in monstrous ways. So again, it really depends on, and this is where the idea of a story world is really useful, on the story world that you're moving in. Like, how far in the past is it? What are the physical laws of that world? What is possible? What kind of stories can you tell in that world? And in mythology, a lot more goes. And in the legendary sagas, again, you can do a lot more things, and the monster can be much more monstrous, both physically and socially, than in the sagas of Icelanders that are set in Iceland, and whose protagonists are like the ancestors of the people who wrote these things. So you really have to distinguish between, the story worlds, the context that we're moving in. And that means that in the legendary sagas, you can then get creatures that are specifically bred by pairing like some kind of bizarre giantess with an evil king, and like magically enhanced. And this creature then stalks the hero, who lives to be 300 years of age. That's in Örvarot saga. So these things are not possible in the sagas of Icelanders that I wrote about. That's only possible in this legendary space of the sagas of old times.
Mm-hmm. So do we get, I guess, is it possible that the troll simply was just like a description for something monstrous? Because it seems like everything can just fall under that. So within, if you have troll, I guess, as like a heading, and then we have the individual stories of the monsters, particularly that are in, I guess, human-esque. Are they similar? As in, like, is there like a subgenre of monsters, or is it like each one is individual? Does that make sense? So I guess almost like, would you see vampire, like not vampires, but like something like a vampire that is one characteristic type of monster that appears in saga after saga after saga, rather than one individual monster in each story? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
I feel like I went a long way around getting there.
I think I understand what you mean. So we definitely have the undead. Someone in the chat just mentioned, I think Draugr is what you mean, Draugr. It's a word that is often applied to the undead, although it's sort of incorrect, because the sagas of Iceland is, I'm glad that we understood each other, Ali. In the sagas of Iceland, these creatures aren't actually called that. So the word Draugr in modern Icelandic means ghost. And that's why folklorists in the 19th century, what is his name? Jón Árnason, I think. He collected folk stories in Iceland, and he grouped them into different taxonomies. And one of the groups that he established was Draugasögur, so stories about the undead, or ghost stories, really. And Ármann Jakobsson himself said that basically because of that, people have used the term Draugr also for the medieval undead, even though the sagas rarely use it. So in the sagas of Iceland, I think there's like 2 instances or something, or 3, in which this term is applied to the undead. Usually the sagas are more interested in what these creatures do than in what they are. And so the words that we see used more frequently are words that relate to the fact that they walk again, after Göngur, literally revenant, something that walks again. Or reynleikar, which means hauntings. So it's about, the fact that they rise from the dead and trouble the living, rather than about the fact that they are physically undead. So these creatures are definitely one category of monster. Within that, we find different subcategories because the monster is very different to grasp. This is part of its essence, which you can't really pin down. Like, it's difficult to say what it actually is, and it constantly escapes attempts at categorizing it. So we do have revenants that are just within their mounds, mound dwellers. They were buried in mounds, and they sit there and they guard their treasure. And as long as you leave them alone, they mostly leave you alone as well. But obviously, treasure is very appealing to heroes, and also fighting revenants is a way of gaining fame. So sometimes a saga hero will break into a mound to fight the revenant and steal his treasure. And in one instance, one of these mound dwellers actually leaves his mound and goes to the court of King Ólafur Tryggvason in Norway and challenges him in a scene that's very similar to what we see in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, where the Green Knight appears at Christmas and issues this challenge that the person who beheads him must come to join him a year afterwards and endure the same fate. And no one dares to do it, and Gawain eventually beheads the Green Knight, and the Green Knight is like, okay, I'll see you in a year, and then Gawain has to travel to the Green Knight and see what that's all about. And in Bárðardal Saga, there's a similar scene where the Revenant appears at the court of the king and again issues a challenge, and Gestur, the son of Bárður, who is a troll, interestingly, so they have a lot in common, those two, the Revenant, who's a troll in a way, and the troll, actual troll. Gestur has to then travel to like the furthest reaches of basically Svalbard, or like very far up in Canada. It's a very paranormal topography, so we can't really pin this down to like this is where this is located, and challenge that revenant. But that's one of the few instances in which a mound dweller actually leaves his mound and like goes somewhere. Normally they don't. But then we do have revenants that go somewhere, and those are the really troublesome kinds. They like to ride roofs. They like to kill sheep. They like to drive people insane. Sometimes the people they kill or who die because of them will then also appear as revenants, which is obviously a problem when your shepherds keep dying and they're also undead. And then there's like this whole group of revenants haunting your farm. Definitely don't want that. And then, you have to find someone to put this haunting to rest. There's one revenant in Laxala Saga who says before he dies, he says to his wife, "I want to be buried standing up under the kitchen doorway," basically. And from that, you already know, okay, this guy is going to be trouble when he's dead because he still wants to guard his farm even after death. And his wife's so scared of him that she complies, but obviously he then comes back to haunt, and he even kills his son, which is rare. Normally they leave their family alone, but this one doesn't. And then you have to find someone who deals with that, because you can't let this go on because they will just keep killing animals, which is a huge problem in a farming community. And they will keep killing humans, which is also a huge problem in any community. And so you have to remove them. And ideally you find a hero like Grettir to dispatch of the Revenant. But the problem with heroes is that sometimes they are quite close to the monster themselves, and that's why we have this situation of the monster hunter, the monster slayer, like a Buffy kind of situation. Buffy, who's herself paranormal, because she's the chosen one, and the creatures she hunts are also paranormal. So there's this closeness that I mentioned with Gestur and this challenging man dweller as well. So sometimes those revenants then find something within the hero that they can latch onto, and Grettir is cursed by the revenant that he kills. And this guy is called Glaumr. He was from Sweden, so also foreigners, weird. When those die, you never know what happens. And Glaumr says to Grettir, "So you've put a lot of trouble into finding me, but this is not going to be good for you. Like, you're definitely not going to carry any luck away from this encounter. And I lay this curse on you that you will see my eyes in front of you in the dark from this point onwards until you die, and that everything that you do will turn to lucklessness and outlawry." And indeed, shortly afterwards, Grettir is outlawed, and he spends 20 years in outlawry. Banished from the community, living on the margins, until he's finally killed by magic. But there are whole chains of malign paranormal activity, one scholar called it. I think it was William Sayers, that happen around the undead. So they are like a huge thing for saga narratives.
So are they? I guess in my mind, when I think of a Draugr, I would say they, or any of this kind of undead revenant type situation, I always see them like more of a zombie than a ghost.
Yeah.
And do we see that distinction? Are they? Because I guess when they come back, is it that they come back in their physical body, or so it's not like an apparition of
exactly.
a ghost, it's their actual body that comes back. So
and that's what makes them so dangerous, because they can use that body, which is often larger and stronger than it was in life. And they can use that body to inflict damage. So it's not just that they have a psychological effect on the living, and they do have that as well. And sometimes they seem to infect them with something so that people who have encountered them die shortly after the encounter. But physically, they're just incredibly destructive. Again, they kill animals and people. Sometimes they will destroy the things around them. Some of them are unstable in their physical form. So this guy who was buried standing up under his kitchen doorway, he can somehow shapeshift into a seal, which then circles the ship of the people who were meaning to settle at his farm, which is now abandoned after he killed his son. And the ship sinks because this was not a normal seal. It was the revenant in the shape of a seal. So sometimes they can cross into like other shapes as well, which is really interesting.
Shapeshift.
Yeah.
Can we just appreciate it's no mean feat to bury somebody stood up? And I assume when you say underneath, they just lifted the did they have floorboards maybe, or just
I don't actually know. Probably
no, just dug the earth and just like dropped him in there and put it back over. That's not easy to do.
No, but it works within the story, and it's narratively it's just super effective because it alerts you to the fact, okay, something is definitely going to happen here. Like
It's
this
an
guy
odd
was trouble in
request.
life. Exactly. Like you don't say that to your wife unless something's up, you know.
Hmm. So do we see ghosts in a modern sense of that? Like it's not a physical body; it's a spirit of somebody that comes back.
Rarely. So in Laxdala Saga, the one of the husbands, I think the third husband of Gudrun Osvigosdottir, the could say protagonist, one of the main protagonists of the saga, um, he drowns and she's walking towards the church, I believe, at the time. And she sees an apparition of her husband standing there with his clothes dripping, and she knows that he's dead. But he's not physically there. They later find his body washed up on the shore, I think. So that's definitely an apparition.
Hmm.
We also have scenes in which
Just
we don't, sorry.
sorry to interrupt. Is that more of like a loving type of apparition? Is he coming to see her in like a loving way rather than a threatening way? And could
He's
maybe
not
that
threatening. It's just a sign that he's died. So I don't remember exactly the way they interact with each other, which is a shame. But I don't know if he says anything to her. Revenants rarely speak.
okay?
So
So
yeah,
maybe it
I'm
could
sorry, I don't
be
remember.
maybe it could be. I guess we've all had that feeling of something bad
Mhm,
happening, and something bad has happened somewhere, and you kind of it's an unexplainable phenomena of the where
mhm.
you kind of just feel a little bit off. So maybe it could be like I guess an explanation of that. Like
Yeah,
it's just her just kind of being
yeah,
told that he's no longer with us. I guess.
yeah, yeah. That could very well be. No, I think it's her second husband. He drowned. Sorry, mix it up. Her third is one of the other main protagonists. Sorry. Um, Yeah, I think that could be. So in rare cases, we get sort of a mixture of the types. So in Eirik Saga Rauða, one of the sagas where they travel to Vinland, there's a guy who dies in a plague or something, or like some kind of epidemic, and he comes back and sort of foretells the future to his former wife or like his widow, really. He seems to be very like he seems to embody that Christian idea of the dead having knowledge of the beyond, and what he tells her is also very Christian, and she is the foremother of various bishops in Iceland. So her descendants are all,
Mm-hmm.
very strongly religious figures. But then there are also scenes in which it's not clear whether the person is physically there, whether it's just an apparition. In Njál Saga, Gunnar sits on his mound and recites poetry, but it's like we don't know. The saga doesn't tell us whether Gunnar is actually physically sitting on his mound or whether he just appears to his son, who's, by the fact that his father recited poetry, he's reminded of the fact that vengeance is still to be
Mm-hmm.
done.
What
So
about
yeah, sometimes there's a lot of ambiguity about these stories as well.
what about things like I guess poltergeist type activity where you would have something move, but there's no body, there's no body or no apparition there. It's just weird things
Yeah,
happening. And
so
what would they put that down to?
I mean, we don't know what these like. There was a suggestion made that the riding of the houses that some revenants do that's due to sheep crawling onto the roofs or like very strong storms that make the same kind of noise where the whole house is sort of rattling and you feel like there is a revenant sat on my roof and
Mm-hmm.
that's the only possible explanation. But I always try like I prefer to look at the way the stories tell it because these things are real within the stories. Um, you can try to sort of look at the way these may be rationalizations of certain natural phenomena, but that's not my approach generally. Sorry, where were we going before? Oh yeah, the Frodau hauntings in Erbygger saga. So this is one of the best haunting stories in all of the sagas because it's super long and elaborate and detailed and amazing. It starts with this elderly woman coming to the farm for Gunnar, who somehow has a weird thing for the young son of the farmer's wife, who's probably not the farmer's son. And she has these nice bedclothes, like linen, very beautiful. And the farmer's wife, she's like, "Oh, this is gorgeous. I wanna have this." And Thorgunn is like, "Nah, I don't think you can make use of this." And then one day, a weird blood rain falls, and Thorgunn is like, "Okay, I'm gonna die from this." And shortly afterwards, she does. And beforehand, she's like, "Please bring me to Skalholt," which is where the bishopric in Iceland is nowadays. It wasn't there back then, but apparently she knew that it was going to be established there. Bring me there and burn my bedclothes. Like I want this gone. The farmer's wife must not have them. But the farmer's wife doesn't burn them, and so obviously, something is attached to that, and we don't really know what exactly. Is it just the greed that's behind farmer's wife's actions, or is there some kind of infection spreading? We don't know. The first bit odd thing that happens after the blood rain, which is also, quite odd.
Yeah, we can't just skip over it raining blood.
Right. The first weird thing is that when people carry the corpse to where it's supposed to be buried, they come to a farm at night and it's really late and they're like soaking wet. And the farmer is super stingy and doesn't want to give them food. So they just, settle down somewhere and try to dry themselves off and go to sleep. And at some point during the night, they hear some weird rustling noises. And when they get up, they see Thorgunna, this old woman who's dead, standing stark naked in the pantry and fixing them a meal. So that's weird. But since they've just been Christianized, they sort of like make the sign of the cross over the meal and they eat it. And it's fine. She didn't mean to harm them. And then she lies quietly. After that, they can carry her to the church. She's buried. It's all good, you would think. Because back at Frodau, at the farm where we were to begin with, weird things start to happen. So there's this moon shape that goes anti-clockwise around the room and no one knows what it is. It's called an Urðamáni, like a fateful moon in Icelandic. There is...
That's interesting for anybody who watches ghost programs. I do like a good ghost program. You always see like little light orbs. That's like one of the most popular things that you catch, like a light anomaly on a camera or a camera or video camera. It's always the little light orbs that float around, and I feel like that's
sort of the same thing. Yeah,
this little. It is kind of like a little moon, I guess, is what you could describe it as.
That is super interesting. The other thing that they notice is that there's this weird dripping sound coming from the pantry, which is like filled with dried fish for the winter. And when they go to check, they find like a seal's tail or something sticking out, and they try to pull on it, but it just rips through their hands and is gone. But all the fish is also gone, as if it had been eaten. So it's just like the fish bones that are still left. And then people start to die.
Cheeky seal.
Yeah, but it was definitely not like a natural seal. There was definitely something going on. Yeah, we don't know. Like obviously a seal would not get like high up in the pantry normally, would it? And then people start to get ill and die in waves. We have one wave of 6 people, then 6 people drown, and then another wave of 6 people die of the same illness. And they all come back. And they all start to haunt the farm. And they end up sitting in the main hall across the fire from each other. And they throw mud at each other because apparently those people who died from sickness didn't like those who drowned. And they just keep quarreling after death.
Wow.
And then the question arises, how do you get rid of that? Because the living are by now, stuck in some kind of outhouse where it's less space for them, less warm, smaller fire. Some of their supplies for the winter are gone. And there's these like 18 dead people sitting around the fire in the big hall. So you have to get rid of those because it's just super disruptive, even though they're not actively threatening, but you still have to remove them. So the idea that people come up with, or like one particularly intelligent person comes up with, who, by the way, is Snorri Goði, the nephew of Gisli.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're all related anyway. But like he advises them to hold a council or like a courtroom, basically a courtroom in front of the door and charge them with trespassing and tell them to leave. And that's what they do. And afterwards they have a priest carry like incense and holy water around the hall and just cleanse it that way. And with this combination of like legal and religious means, the revenants are gone.
I feel like that's quite polite of them. They left quite well. But that would suggest that they the humans and the ghost type spirits can't kind of exist in the same place. Because I guess for the most part, you would, or when you associate like a haunting, it's usually you stay in an area and the ghostly activities happen around you. Whereas they seem like they were almost forced to. But do you think it would be they were there out of fear for what was happening, or just because this was happening and they couldn't be in that space, which would kind of seem as though everything was very physical that was happening, as if those ghosts were just really there. Because obviously, I can only go by like I've never been in a paranormal situation, but only from kind of like what you watch on TV or films, and you have this idea of ghosts of kind of being there, not being there, and they're kind of in and out, and maybe they're causing a little bit of kerfuffle, but it's not a very physical, tangible thing that's there constantly that would kind of force a whole group of people to just move to an outhouse.
Yeah, so in the sagas, most of the time, we do have this physical presence, and people are afraid of them, even though they're not actively threatening. So unlike someone like Glaumur, or in the same saga, we have another guy who goes around, killing people, even his wife, and he's a whole mess. He comes back as a monstrous bull and then kills more people. But anyway, super interesting story as well. But like, unlike those people, those groups of revenants at this particular farm, they don't really do anything. They're just a nuisance, but they're still dangerous and frightening because they're undead. And you shouldn't have undead people sitting around your fire at home, because people shouldn't be undead. They should either be alive or dead. Like, that's a thing that should just not happen. So that in itself is so terrifying that people will run away from it.
Yeah. And it seems that they can use provisions as well. I guess I never really thought of a ghost having to eat, but
yeah, we don't know what exactly eats all the fish. Like, it's completely unclear. It's just one of those facets of this particular story of hauntings, but it has more of this poltergeisty feel to it that you were mentioning. So I did want to talk about it briefly. And then also we have this story about the old woman who comes back and like makes food for everyone. It's just like such an iconic scene in saga literature. It's great.
I think we've spoke about that on one of the previous Halloween episodes, and it's such an endearing story. I feel like I wouldn't mind if I had a haunting, and you know what, I still wouldn't like it.
Right? Yeah. It's not great.
Yeah, even if she was making me food, and I like food, but I'd still would be a little bit creeped out. But then if she was polite, I guess.
She doesn't interact with the living at all. So the revenants that they charged with trespassing, they all say, well, I stayed here while I was welcome, basically, and now that I'm no longer welcome, I leave. That's what they imply. So they actually talk to the living in this instance, but she doesn't interact at all. Ideally, the less the undead interact with the living, the less problematic they are. The more they interact, the more disturbing they are. So in Svartdala Saga, we have this guy called Clovey, who's a berserk in life as well. So we've got multiple dimensions of monstrosity coming together in this one guy. And he is killed with the help of his wife, I guess. I mean, he abducted her, so we don't know if that it's a legal marriage or whatever. She sort of, together with her brother, she orchestrates his death. And within hours of his death, he comes back and tries to get into her bed. So he's clearly very much fueled by sort of sexual drives. And then they behead him. And normally that's fine. Revenants will not come back after they're beheaded. Ideally, you place their head between their buttocks, which has been suggested as a way of shaming the undead by putting their mouth sort of where their anus is. But for Clovey, being beheaded is no problem at all. He just takes his head and he speaks poetry with it, and he travels around and he uses it as a weapon, waving it at people. And everyone is obviously terrified of this guy because he was a menace in life, and now he's undead and like 10 times worse. So with him, the only way of laying him to rest is fire. So you have to completely destroy his body afterwards. Yeah, it's a great weapon. Like, it's very effective.
Mm-hmm. That's so fascinating because I remember I visited one of the old abandoned medieval villages called Warren Percy in England, and they had I'm trying to remember it now because it's been a while since I was there, and they had a similar situation where they bury people in the graveyard, and if I remember correctly, they were haunting the village, so they dug them up, slashed the bones, burnt the bones, and then reburied them in a mass grave outside of the village walls. And they found this pit basically with all these different bones in from different, almost from different time period, not different time periods, but like not too close together. Not so they didn't all die at the same time. Right. They'd all kind of a lot of the bones had been slashed or crushed. So it was very like post-mortem mutilation. And it was fascinating. So it's kind of fascinating that it's clearly something that goes on within like medieval England as well.
Yeah. So I think destroying the body and like the integrity of the body is a very good way of getting rid of monsters. It's something that you do with other monsters as well, like with berserks. A lot of the time they are somehow magically protected through their ability to go berserk. They can't be touched by fire or iron. And how do you break someone's body if you can't cut into it with your sword? Well, if you're a hero, then you can overcome those limitations, or you have the power of Christianity on your side. That's also very helpful. You have a fire that you bless with, holy water and whatnot. And the berserk is like trying to prove his superiority and walks through it and is burned. But ideally, you cut parts of their body off or break into their physical integrity in another way. So again, in Rebecca saga, this is just a fantastic saga because it's like it has this haunting story that I just told with the old woman and the blood rain and the weird moon and all that kind of stuff. It also has an amazing story about two berserk brothers who are brought to Iceland by a chieftain who fancies himself like a bit of a king, because berserks are great when they serve a king, but they're problematic when they have nothing to do, when they can't channel their immense strength and disruptive natures into something useful. So if they're like elite bodyguards for a king, super. But if they're like roaming around the Icelandic landscape or even the Norwegian landscape, very problematic. But these guys, they're brought to Iceland basically against their will, and they're like, "What are we even doing here? Like this sucks. We want something to do." But since they don't have anything to do, one of the guys falls in love with the daughter of the farmer they're staying with, and he even speaks like love poetry for her. So this is in a very stylized meter that you associate with the highest degrees of skaldic poetry in the Middle Ages. And the Scandinavian Middle Ages. And it's just weird to see that. But the girl, we never see her response. And the father's like, this is not happening. I'm not marrying my daughter to a berserk. So how do you get rid of these guys? Because they're obviously much stronger than everyone else in the area. And again, Snorri, Gisli's nephew, comes up with a clever plan because he's like, this mob boss who's like pulling all the strings in the background of like Icelandic society, and he devises all the clever plans. And they give the berserks a task of building a wall around the farm and clearing a road through the lava field. And this task exhausts them so much that they can't go berserk and they can't access their immense strength. And when they come back like super exhausted and tired, this is basically like when you're really upset and you're super angry and afterwards you just exhausted, this sort of after an adrenaline rush, you're just completely knackered. And that's what happens with berserks as well. This is what they count on. So they come back and they're like wiped. And the farmer says, well, we've prepared this nice bathhouse for you guys. How about you, sit down in the sauna and, relax a bit because you've been doing all this hard work for us. And the guys are like, yeah, cool. Okay, we'll do that. Turns out the bathhouse is super hot. They are trying to get outside, but the combination of this extreme heat and the exhaustion makes them vulnerable. And so they can be beheaded as they try to get out of the bathhouse. So you have to find really, like, if you don't have a hero who can just, chop off an arm or a leg, breaking the body in this way, you have to come up with strategies.
Quite elaborate.
Yeah, right. Super elaborate.
Yeah, I feel like there's a a huge room for error in that plan, but
Yeah.
it worked.
Yeah.
So I find that interesting. So would a berserk, are they always classified as monsters? Do they? Because I think for most people, I would say, they seem to be like just a warrior elite, but very much a human figure that's just a warrior. Yeah, like a warrior elite, probably for maybe like say for a king or somebody of noble standing, and just be yeah, I guess elite warriors are the best way to put it, rather than some type of monster. I've never
So
really seen them described as that.
So this again depends on what context they appear in, and I think this like the story world's idea comes into that, and then also just the context in which they appear. So as you said, in the retinue of the king as their bodyguards, it's like the guys who are the first in line to attack when someone goes raiding or has like a huge battle with ships and whatnot. They're great for that. They will fight for their king, fantastic. They will crush the opposition. This is really what you want as a king. But it really depends on them respecting the king enough to actually do what the king says, because they're stronger than the king and they could just smash the guy's head if they wanted to. But they don't, because they have like a natural respect for that authority figure. So it's a very classist society as well, with the king at the top, and you have all these ideas attached to royal authority, which are somehow translated into Berserk stories. And in this story that I just mentioned in Erbikja saga, we see this as well, because this Icelandic farmer brings them to Iceland from Norway, where he encountered them at the court of a Norwegian ruler, where they were fine. They were at the ruler's court, they were doing their thing, it was fine, they were in control, or they were being controlled. But then they come to Iceland, and this guy who brought them over, he doesn't have this natural royal authority, and he cannot control them, and he doesn't have the kind of work for them that they would like to do. So he gives them to his brother, who's more violent in temper, and he sort of uses them as his personal like hitmen, essentially. And as that, they're also okay. But then they fall in love with the daughter and want to marry into the family, and you definitely can't allow that. If berserks appear outside of a context in which there's some control over them and their abilities, they turn into bandits, they turn into rapists, they just cause a lot of trouble for people. So Gisla Saga opens with the story of this berserk, I think he's called Björn Blackie, who goes around challenging men for their wives and their daughters. And this is how, this entire story starts out, and why we need this sword Grausida to overcome the berserk, because he kills one of the brothers, the berserk kills one of the brothers trying to get to his wife. And the other brother, I think it's the first Gisli, he says, well, I need to get myself a better weapon. And he gets this sword Grausila, and they fight, and he kills the berserk because he had this sword. But then he doesn't want to give the sword back, and that's where this whole tragedy starts, with the magic weapon and the things that happen afterwards.
It does feel like there's a lot of comparisons between that and the military elite of today, and without being offensive to anybody who's military elite, if you had, you have things like the SAS, the Navy SEALs, the real top. They're wonderful when they're doing the job, I guess, that they're paid to do. But if you then took them away from that, or they left that and then worked independently as a mercenary, you would then, those skills are then being used maybe for more nefarious reasons. And it also feels like it has a very hyper masculine feel to it, which you kind of get also within that upper kind of, or it's typically seen with like that upper, maybe not even just the military elite, typically with military in general, that kind of hyper masculine type feel that you get going on there.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why the sexual threat they pose, and the fact that they often appear as rapists, that is really the main problem with them. because they will take your daughters and your wives and your sisters away from you for a time and violate them and then sort of give them back, abused and maybe pregnant. And so the reason why Clovey in Svartdala Saga, the guy with the beheaded revenant who speaks poetry with his head, the reason why he's so problematic is because he's the son of a berserk. So there's this line of berserkism sort of running through his family. So the implication is that if this berserk rapes your sister and she's pregnant, then your nephew, who's sort of born out of this abuse, will also probably be a berserk. This is sort of like an implication that we see in some sagas, that this seems to be a hereditary thing.
Okay.
But interestingly, when you just mentioned like elite combat specialist in today's society, it's interesting that berserkism has also been compared to combat trauma in modern day veterans, that it's like somehow tied to PTSD, and that's why they go into this intense rage.
Okay.
So yeah, this is a really interesting idea as well. And what's his name? Roderick Dale has written a great book about berserks as well. So definitely recommend that.
Yeah, Roderick's been on here twice.
Oh,
actually.
fantastic! Obviously,
so
then you, yeah.
For anybody that does want to know more about Berserkers, then I would recommend his episodes without a doubt. We did one on the Great Heathen Army and a little bit of Berserkers, but we did one sole episode on I think it's called the Berserker Strut, the episode, because we spoke about this idea that it could possibly be like a war dance to get people in a frenzy before war. But yeah, I feel like Berserkers it's a tough one in a sense of the most people really kind of glorify them in a sense of when it comes to Nordic mythology, because they're quite cool, they can't be hurt by fire or iron. They go into this rage, and there's probably there is a lot of misconceptions when it comes to them as well. But it is kind of that whole thing of like Vikings being super. It is cool that kind of really good warriors and they do what needs to be done and whatever. It is that thing. So to describe them as like monstrous, I've never really come across that before. But I can also see it. I can completely. Kind of...
For me, it's always like it's weird to see them glorified in this way, coming from the opposite perspective. I once saw a guy in the gym who had like shorts on or trousers, whatever it was, with like sort of in this sort of pseudo runic script, and Berserk written down the side of the pant leg, and I was like, is this really what you want to emulate? Like these guys who go around raping women? Like, is this really the type of masculinity that you want to embody? But obviously people don't know about that.
Exactly.
People see the context where they appear as like elite warriors, and we do have that, that's not wrong, but it's only part of the picture. So we also have to look at these other stories in which they appear as incredibly disruptive and incredibly violent, and, as rapists who abuse women. Who abuse women to shame the men in their family, who saying, you couldn't control the women, you couldn't fight me, you couldn't defeat me, so I'm taking her away from you. That's also a side of the story, and we have to look at that as well. And that's the thing with the monstrous, right? There's no easy way of framing it. There's no easy way of understanding it. Like you think, okay, I've looked at berserks, now I know what the monster is. But then you see stories about berserks in the King sagas, and there they play a completely different role. As elite bodyguards. And in the legendary sagas that I was talking about earlier, they can be problematic, but in a very different way. Like the sexual element is far less important there, frequently. Like I wouldn't say it always, but in many stories, it's just not really what those sagas are interested in. So in the Icelandic saga and the sagas of Icelanders, their main threat is through their sexual violence. So, it's so complicated to say, okay, this is what this creature is, and I understand it. Because then you look at a different text and suddenly there's a different dimension that you can't really factor into the theory that you've just constructed.
Yeah, I think it's a super fascinating, different perspective of what a berserker is. And, I've done 170 something episodes. I think that's what we're in now. And I've never come across or even like heard of like the monstrous side of a berserk and the the sexual dominance. So I feel like if I've not heard of it, then the chance of the average kind of layperson who's interested in this kind of stuff, they're only going to see not the fun side, but the glorified side, which you can kind of get behind and be like, especially when it comes to gym wear.
Yeah.
It's like that idea of this warrior elite. It's cool. So yeah, I find that really fascinating, and it's something that we probably need to educate people on more. I think
so too.
So they do know what they're wearing. And I guess is there a chance that this kind of darker side is down to like Christian propaganda of like to demean them? Or I mean, I would probably say it's not going to be that, because I would assume this kind of behavior is something that very much goes back for probably as old as time.
So the literature that this is in, the depiction I was talking about, is the sagas of Icelanders. I mean, all of the creatures that I looked at, and we see this as well with magic users, who you obviously just talked about with Gwen Knight. We see this as well with them, that this type of monstrosity, or this attachment to like paranormal forces that we see with Berserks, their power obviously that is associated with Odin. Then with Revenants, obviously they're part of the past because they're undead and they don't belong to the present anymore. The power of the magic users also comes from like, it's called forneskja, old beliefs, old practices. People are called fort í brögðum, old-fashioned in their practices. That's like a euphemism for magic, or for magic use. So all of that is associated with the pagan past. Mm-hmm. Is it a way of Christian authors explaining this stuff away? Maybe. But I mean, all of this was written by people who are very firmly Christian and probably didn't have a lot of need for that. So it's more a question of why the monstrous is located in this past. Why is it so firmly associated with something that is gone but still haunts the present? What echoes of the past, pagan and otherwise, are still present in the present that don't let go of us? What is the threat that is still lurking back there? And that's what I was then looking at, because I don't think we can ever fully answer the question whether something is like Christians trying to, make sense of something, or like propagandizing against something, because we just don't have the sources from before the conversion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's why I was actually wondering whether we see any of these creatures or monsters in any pre-Christian sense, or do we know like whether they exist? Because I've always wondered whether ghosts are just a mainly Christian thing.
I mean, we have old Eddic poems that have people rising up from the dead, probably. So Völuspá, for example, where the Völva, that probably Odin, we assume it's Odin, talks to, she seems to come back from the dead. And in another poem, Odin is also seen like bringing a Völva back from the dead to ask her questions. So there seems to be some idea of the undead. I mean, we see, ideas of the undead in most cultures throughout history, in different ways. Obviously, vampires crop up in like different times and different places, representing all sorts of different ideas. And then we have zombies and, various other configurations of that. We have picture stones and other things that depict these animal warriors that have been associated with berserks, but we don't really know whether it's the same concept. This is what I've liked to call the berserk soup, where people have thrown everything from like Tacitus to like 15th century legendary sagas and like gold brackets and a couple of picture stones and some runic inscriptions into like one pot and stirred it all around and like just, pulled out of it whatever they needed for their argument. So a lot of the scholarship, like the older scholarship on berserks, is very problematic. And And I also know that Roderick and I disagree on something, so I don't think he subscribes to this notion of hereditary berserkism, which is absolutely fair. This is why we're scholars who have different approaches, different ideas, and ultimately we need all of them to come to a better understanding of it. So yeah, but like we don't really know, because a lot of the material that we have from before the conversion is very vague. And then we do have skaldic poetry, for example, which mentions Berserker and Ulfhednar, which seem to be like related forms of animal warriors. So there seems to be something going on there, but it's more often than not, it's easier to just look at one context rather than trying to actually, understand all of it, because it's very difficult to do that, because we have to use different methodologies, apply different historical contexts to different types of sources. So that's why I choose to look at one genre and the depiction of a particular character type in one genre or one group of sagas. And then from that, we can compare. But yeah, other people are much more knowledgeable about the pictorial representations of this in pre-Christian art.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. Okay, so I have a new little thing that I like to do in the episodes where I find something online and we find out whether it's misinformation, we debunk it. So I found a little list on a website of different monsters from Nordic mythology, or Norse mythology as they put it, but my old co-host used to tell me off for using that word, so we don't use it anymore. So I wanted to go through there. I will say most of them aren't human-esque. They are probably more of the typical type monsters. I thought if you have time, we could just go through a few and see what's real, what's not real. Okay, so the first one is trolls, obviously.
Yeah, very real.
Yeah, as we clearly have just spoken about. But it seems that it's not they're not limited to the typical idea of what we would think of, or what most people would think of a troll from. Things like Troll Hunter Troll, those little figurines with the long hair that we used to see. Mm-hmm. So they're not just those. I guess
they're also maybe not the little figurines. Those are folklore trolls from like later Scandinavian folklore. They're also like the sort of gianty figures that live in the mountains. But they're so much more. It's like the concept of the troll sort of embodies the problem that we have dealing with monstrosity, because it's so many things that we don't really know what it is.
Mm-hmm. So the next one were nisses.
That's also a folklore creature.
Okay, so that's
not in medieval literature. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, this is the Vikings, mythical monsters and elves. So they're much later. Are you able to give a quick overview of what they are?
Oh God, I'm not a folklorist at all.
Oh, okay.
I should be more knowledgeable about these things, but I'm really not.
No.
I think they're like small, spirits but I'm just just half remembering things from my childhood here. So,
so this is that each Viking family had at least one Nissa living in their barn. The Nissa protected their animals and their home. In exchange, the family made little gifts and left them in the barn for the Nissas to enjoy gifts of tiny hats and jackets. Which makes sense, because we all the ones that I think Nissa is more of a Norwegian term for them, if I'm not mistaken.
The tomte, yeah.
They're like the little. I think in England we have a bad habit of calling them gronks. Is it gronks? Because we get them from IKEA. Those little Christmas figurines. You know, the ones that we see in IKEA at Christmas with like the long tall hat and the big open nose. This kind of got popular in the last 5 years. I think as from what I know, I think that this is like a depiction of them, but it could be completely wrong.
But this is something that we see in a lot of cultures. Like in Germany, we have similar like household spirits that sort of, guard the homestead or like contribute to the housework. And then, as people were saying just in the chat, you leave things out for them, especially food. They like food. And you try to make sure that, everything's in a certain way and that you pay attention and respect to them, because otherwise they get angry and destroy things. So I think that's something that we see across a lot of different countries and cultures. And this is one possible Scandinavian iteration of it. But there's not to my knowledge, there's no medieval evidence for that kind of thing. So we do have land spirits, landbeichter, that I mentioned in the sagas, but they are not household spirits. They're spirits that live within the land, and which can be offended very easily if you do the wrong things. Like you don't want to pee in certain spots, for example, because that might be offensive to them. And you want to take the animal heads off your ship before you sail into harbor, because they also might not like that. And sometimes they can drive people insane as well. So you definitely want to be careful with them, but they're not associated to particular households.
Yeah, perfect. The next one is the Fossagrimmen.
Oh God, I don't know anything about that. I'm really sorry.
Well, I mean, these are all sold as Viking monsters. So
this all sounds like Scandinavian folklore to me. But like, I think we've got Scandinavians here, right? So maybe people in the chat can jump in.
No, but it does its job anyway, because anybody that comes across this and is reading them as Viking, because there some websites put them out there as Viking, at least we can get rid of that. So this says the Vikings believed the Fossagrimmen was a scary-looking ghost who haunted brooks and creeks. All the Fossagrimmen ever did was play his fiddle. The Vikings knew when the Fossagrimmen was around, they could hear the fiddle in the sound of running water. The Vikings did not try to catch a glimpse of the Fossagrimmen. They were pretty sure he was harmless, but just in case, they kept their distance.
Again, I have never heard of a medieval story about this, but it might exist. Also, we don't know how old folk stories are, obviously, so that can have long roots. And there's a similar creature in Germany, which I think is called the Neck, which does similar things and like haunt streams and waterfalls. So
okay, but it's not a Viking monster.
Not that I know, no.
Yes. Okay, the next one is the Mare.
Okay. Is it like
should I read the description?
Read it out. Yeah, please do. Please do.
The Vikings believe. I always know usually when a website's bullshit because they just use the word Vikings repeatedly over and over and over. The Vikings believed if you could not see it, it could not harm you, but that did not mean it could not affect you, because it could. The Mare was a hideous creature who leaped on people at night while they were sleeping and gave them bad dreams. This is perhaps why bad dreams are called nightmares. A bad dream might be unpleasant, but it could not really harm you, not like a sword or a dagger.
So yeah, we do have maybe a related concept of being Draugrs, like troll-ridden, which sort of possesses you in a way. It is maybe a way of making sense of sleep paralysis, because you can't move when this thing is sitting on you. And there's an idea that magic users can induce something similar. So again, in Rebecca Saga, which has all the stories about all of the paranormal things, there are two magic using women who are in contest with each other, trying to seduce this young man who they're basically tutoring, teaching magic, and one of them overwhelms him at night and does something of this sort to him, and he's found the next morning and he's all disturbed and mentally not very well. So there seems to be something like that in the sagas as well.
Okay, but it's not called.
No.
Okay, so it looks like they've taken something that's there, but not.
So it's called a Trollrida or Hamrida. So it has again to do with trolls, always like shape shifting potentially. Because Hamr is a shape word.
All right, we've got two more.
Oh, okay.
And I'm betting neither of them are from the Viking Age. The Pester.
Again, never heard of it.
That's never good when somebody who specializes in monsters in Nordic mythology goes, never heard of it?
Again, I think the Scandinavians who are listening to this probably know more about this than I do.
Yeah, but it just shows that they've taken something that's Scandinavian and just attributed it to being Viking, which is
happens
frustrating.
so
But
often.
yeah, and then people who don't know any better just go, okay, that's clearly Viking, and then it just lives on forever as bullshit. So we're doing our job. We're doing a public service here.
But if it's a personification of the plague, then it you would think it appears in medieval sources. So I need to chase this. I want to know more about this. Someone was just writing that in the chat. That
yeah. So this is during the Middle Ages, when the plague spread across Europe, a tale began of an old woman dressed all in black, carrying a broom and a rake. As the story goes, if you caught sight of the pester, you would get the plague and die. Knowing he would die anyway, a Viking might try to kill the pester to save his family and home. The pester was a magical creature, so the odds were the Viking could not kill her. But just because the odds were against him, him never stopped a Viking from trying. In fucking hell, they've used the word Viking here a lot. In Viking times, clothes were decorated with embroidery and brightly colored dyes. Not only did that make clothes beautiful, but no woman wanted to be mistaken for pester by wearing all black. Bullshit. Fucking bullshit.
Yeah, I mean, also since the plague came to Norway in like 1350, which is, quite a long time away from the Viking Age. So I would assume that there are medieval mentions of this creature, and I'm definitely going to look this up. And thank you also for the reference to Ketilsson, whose paintings, they are the trolls that we think of, for sure. But again, this is not in the sagas. So Icelanders do not have this conceptualization. And since most of our textual sources that we look at in Old Norse Icelandic studies, hence the name, are from Iceland, this has never crossed my mind, or like my desk. But should be there somewhere. So I will look that up.
Yeah.
It's given me inspiration now.
Wonderful. Okay. The Nokken.
Yes, that's the equivalent of the neck. That's right. That's a water-related creature as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it's also called the Knock. It was not a nice monster.
Yeah.
He was a water creature who lived in ponds. He was a shapeshifter, which meant he could change his shift to look just like about anything. One of his favorite shapes was that of a beautiful young man who tempted women to come and swim with him. This description is really long. I don't know.
No, I think that should be okay. Again, this is something from later folklore and fairy tales. Definitely not in the sagas.
Okay, perfect. The last one. I'm hopeful for this one. The Kraken. The Kraken was the worst of all. He was a huge crab or octopus-looking water creature who lived in the sea, and he was enormous. Enormous. Some said he was larger than a ship. Others insisted he was larger than an island. The Kraken had no mercy. He had only one job: to drag a ship down to the bottom of the sea. The only way to save yourself from the Kraken was to abandon ship and try and keep yourself afloat until you reached land or were rescued by another ship.
Yeah, so I don't know where this comes from. It may be Greek, as someone just says in the chat. Definitely not in the sagas. What we do have in the sagas are those sea mammals. As I mentioned earlier, there's stories about paranormal seals or walruses drowning ships by circling them or like looking at them in a funny way. So we have similar ideas, but not in octopus shape.
See, that's the only one that I'd heard previously to this that was of like Viking Age origin. It was, for some reason, it was one that that stuck with me, that I'd heard, but I can't remember where I'd heard it, and I definitely heard it pre-podcast, so it's likely complete bullshit. For some reason the Kraken had started out as but maybe it wasn't called the Kraken or something, I don't know. But it started out life as like a Nordic monster, but I don't know.
Now I'm constantly second guessing myself because I'm like, is this just something that I know nothing about?
It's okay. I completely put you on the spot. Maybe someone in the chat can.
Yeah, I look forward to discussing that.
Okay, I have one more. This is one that I think we've spoken about before. Um, the Nukalave, Nuk Nukalevi,
How do you spell that?
Nuckelavee. Uh, is a horse-like demon from
Oh,
Orcadian folklore. Oh, so from the Orkneys.
hmm.
That combines equine and human elements. British
Yes.
folklorist Catherine Briggs called it the nastiest of all demons of Scotland's Northern Island. The Nukalave or Nukalave. Uh, Nukaleve's breath was thought to wilt crops and sicken livestock. I've met some people who have breath like that. And the creature was held responsible for not naming it, can't name.
Better not to.
Yeah, and the creature was held responsible for droughts and epidemics on land, despite being predominantly a sea dweller. And I feel like I read somewhere once that it like breathes fire or some shit. It's like a terrifying creature.
Yeah, so obviously, if we're then talking about, Orcadian folklore and Norwegian and Swedish folklore, obviously, when we talk about the Vikings, we can incorporate just anything from anywhere in that huge geographical area that they did actually travel to. But what is then Viking?
Yeah.
What is actually like a Viking age creature? Obviously, I'm mostly familiar with the Icelandic sources, and some of the Norwegian stuff, but not a lot of it because I mostly work on Iceland. Um, so in a specific time frame. So obviously a lot of that falls outside of the sources that we work on. But yeah, I mean, we have with these kinds of creatures, we do have similar ideas. There's like this monster called Selkotla, which is this seal-headed creature in a bishop's saga, which is very strange. So we have all sorts of like folkloric kind of figures in different groups of sagas as well. It just again it depends on the context in which they appear.
Mhm.
And this is why I personally think we have to be so sensitive of the context and like the background and the people that created these stories if we know anything about them. Obviously, with folklore, that's difficult. So we can date it even less than we can date medieval stories. Rather than conflating things and trying to make things into what we would like them to be, the Berserk soup and all that, or like the Viking monster soup that we just
Yeah.
delved into.
Mhm.
Because some of these things are very specific in a specific cultural context, and then they become conflated with all sorts of other
Yeah.
ideas. And yeah,
It seems like all of them come from post Viking Age, and then they're
most, yeah.
just because they're somewhere in that Scandinavian sphere. People who don't know any better, or they're just wanting to write a quick blog, go, oh, this is Viking. So Alyssa did some digging on the Kraken,
Mm.
and just to kind of paraphrase the paragraph, it seems like it's the Kraken is a mythical animal from Norwegian folklore in the form of a huge sea monster or a gigantic fish that fishermen are said to have seen along the coast of Norway. But it seems like the oldest story is from the 13th century. So again,
Yeah, so the King's Mirror, Konungsskuggsjæl, that does mention stories about various monstrous creatures like that. That's true. We also have stories about like of like sea dwelling creatures that sort of like mer people, like mermen, that are also monstrous and like to sink ships and like pull people down into the sea. So there are definitely ideas about that. Yeah, that's true.
wonderful. Okay, let's wrap this up and do a little Q&A if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for joining. Do you want to give a little shout out for anything you want to push, I guess, whether it's your social medias or your books, anything you want to throw some eyes on or ears?
So yeah, I'm sort of moving away from Twitter, so you can find me on Blue Sky as well. Both for I still call it Twitter. I refuse to call it whatever it's called now. Both communities. My username is Becca Merkelbach. Just one word, Becca Merkelbach. if you're interested in monsters, read my book, Monsters in Society, Alterity, Transgression, and the Use of the Past in Medieval Iceland. That should be out in open access now, or you can just email me and I'll send you a PDF. My second book on the post-classical sagas will be out next year sometime. So watch this space. It'll come out with Boydell and Brewer.
You can come back and talk about that when it's due.
Oh, I'd love to.
Absolutely.
This has been a lot of fun.
It has, yeah. I love these. I always love when something completely changes my mind on something.
Well, I'm glad.
Because again, before I was like, Berserkers are cool. They're harmless warriors. Turns out they're not. They're just shitty men.
Some of them are, as with humans, so often, there's more than one truth, and they can be called warriors, but they can also be really awful.
Yeah. That rings true for like I said, most of everything, I guess.
Yeah.
Everyone wants to. I feel like at the moment, probably down to social media, people want to look through everything as black and white. Probably, unfortunately, literally at the minute, but also kind of figuratively, that everything just kind of is very simple and everything fits into these two boxes. Pick a team, left or right, red or blue, or whatever it is. And then if you go in that box, then fuck you, I don't like you anymore. And it's not like everything's just grey.
Yeah.
Well, life's grey.
This is why we need the monster as well as from like a cultural standpoint, because it challenges us. It challenges us to reevaluate these preconceptions that we have and to take a different look at our own perspectives and viewpoints that, that we have ingrained in ourselves, and like think about things in a different way, because it can't be boiled down into these binaries. It can't be like, this is the one thing and this is the other and this is the monster. It's super complicated. It's super ambiguous. So I think this is what we all need to do more, right? Look at the different sides and try to see the facets as much as that's possible.
Yeah, let's jump over and do a Q&A. I have some more questions I want to ask, like what the most horrific story is, and I have a few other things. So if you want to check out the Q&A, it's just Patreon/Nordic Mythology podcast. Like I say, it's £3 a month. It's 10p a day, and you get the whole back catalogue on there as well. So there's, I don't know how many episodes there is on there, but we've been doing it for a while now with the guests. So there is going to be a bunch on there that you can listen to. And yeah, there's a ton of other things. Just go check it out, please. It's worth it, in my opinion, anyway. And if you want to follow me, it's Daniel_Farrand1 on Instagram. That's me personally, or the business at Horns of Odin, or just Nordic Mythology Podcast on all the different platforms. Perfect. Let's jump in and do some Q&A.